Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
This has to do with the safety aspect of the Olympics. What can you do as a president to ensure that Southern California, the greater Los Angeles area, is safe from any fire danger? What can you ensure for that?
Well, as you know, Brian, we have I've been fighting with them for a long time about allowing the water to come down. And we actually opened up that water pretty strongly. We got a lot of opposition from the governor, and we opened it up anyway, and the water is coming down. That we want it opened further. They have a lot of water. They send it out into the Pacific Ocean in order to protect the smelt. It's a little tiny fish that's not doing very well, especially when they don't have water. They really do badly, okay?
Welcome to Quiet Right, the politics podcast that slow cooks its takes on a low heat rather than nuking them in a microwave. I'm Andreou.
And I'm Naomi Smith, the marinade for Alex's protein.
We work on 3 simple principles: that you are at least as smart as we are, that nuance is a form of resistance, and that democracy is an act.
So speak your mantras, open your chakras, and let's begin another Quiet Riot.
Hello and welcome to Quiet Right. I'm Alex.
And I'm Naomi.
This week, as America enters the find out phase of FAFO, Trump tries to fire or prosecute anyone who dares to even hint that his latest project, the Trump Golden Age, may be going the way of the Trump University, the Trump Taj Mahal, the Trump Shuttle, Trump Magazine, Trump Vodka, and Trump Steaks.
And as Stephen Yaxley Lennon, aka Tommy Robinson, starts another crowdfunder after getting arrested yet again, Nigel Farage complains he cannot walk in the West End wearing all of his jewellery. And a cryptocurrency whines about its dystopian ad getting banned. We investigate the grift that relies on being simultaneously all-powerful and perpetually victimised.
And to help us, we are delighted to welcome back the most quotable Yankee this side of the Atlantic, Dr. Brian Klaas. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks so much for having me.
Brian, you recently wrote on your brilliant Substack, and listeners, link as ever in the show notes, go check it out, about the value of slowing down. I wanted to ask you, why do we feel so constantly put upon, despite having more control than most of our ancestors ever had?
Yeah, it's, the reason I wrote this is I think there's this sort of ubiquitous mindset in 21st century life that if you're not part of hustle culture, if you're not racing to sort of get the next goal and sort of fulfill your metrics on every conceivable aspect of your life, that you're somehow a failure. I don't feel that that's true. I think there's so many reasons that's not true. And I think the most fulfilled people are those who make space in their life for the things that actually matter to them. I think there's a sort of obsession with stuff and status in the modern world, and you have to race to get those things. And most fulfillment comes from people and things that make us passionate. And those don't end up in YouTube videos and on sort of the bro podcasts as life hacks to a better life. So that's what I was trying to write as a corrective.
And I think that, like me, having a dog forces you to step out from that rat race 3 times a day minimum, to take them out and stretch their legs. And you cannot simultaneously be throwing a ball, picking up dog poo, and checking whether you're hitting your sales targets and what your macros are going to be in your dinner. Do you agree that things like owning a dog can really help get that balance back in your life?
Yeah, I think for me, it's a huge part of it. And actually, it's a lot of my most creative moments are walking the dog, because you're sort of often, for me at least, I'm in nature. I'm not looking at my phone. I'm just sort of thinking, and I'm very present. And so in addition to the sort of weight off the shoulders that comes with the relaxation of slowing down, you also, I think, get much better ideas.
Yeah.
The idea that you're going to just sit at your computer and if you spend more time on Microsoft Teams, suddenly all the problems of the world will be solved is just obviously not true, but that's the way we pretend good ideas emerge and so on. So I just think there's this very strong sense in 21st century life that we're constantly bludgeoned with. And fill your calendar to the max, do every possible thing, hustle all the time. It's tempting to fall into that trap, but it really, for me personally, has been unfulfilling when I've done that. And I'm much, much happier when my Google Calendar has some space in it.
And listeners, just before we get into the main show, I really wanted to thank everyone, and I know many of you did it, who took the action that Best for Britain put out to send a complaint email to Sky News about their incessant coverage using Reform UK's own streaming service. More than 6,000 people wrote in, and Sky has adjusted this week how they've been covering him. So when Farage did his latest press conference on Monday, Sky didn't use the Reform UK feed. They used their own camera and they switched away from it much more quickly than they have done previously. And I just think that is proof, should we need it, that calls to action do work. So a huge thank you from us and bravo.
In many ways, the truly extraordinary thing about the situation in America right now is how quickly our brains seek to accommodate the daily absurdity as an automatic mental health defense strategy. Fail to normalize events one morning, and you risk being overwhelmed by that afternoon. On Tuesday, Trump just casually strolled out of a White House window and took questions from a press pack, the first of which was, "Mr. President, what are you doing on the roof?" He shouted back a combination of unintelligible words and exaggerated gestures, so that part of it was like every other day, at least. I guess that's one way to avoid difficult questions on the Epstein scandal. He was followed by bewildered security people whispering in the microphone who had clearly not planned for that scenario because why would you? And a young aide filming him on her phone, one suspect for a WhatsApp group entitled, "You'll never guess what the salmon scrotum did today." But maybe we're being harsh. Trump has, after all, put himself in charge of the Kennedy Center, so maybe this was scoping out a site-specific promenade production of Kiddie Fiddler on the Roof. The story received fresh fuel this week when Ghislaine Maxwell, who is serving a 20-year prison sentence for her involvement in Epstein's crimes, was moved to a minimum security facility so lush it is known as Club Fed, after meeting with Trump's Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche, for several hours last week. So, Brian, let's start with the Epstein stuff. I am less interested in theories and gossip, and much more interested in the fact that big chunks of Trump's base are seriously kicking back on this. Here's Joe Rogan.
When Trump got into office, one of the things that everyone was promised was you're going to find out the Epstein client list. And today they just finally said there's no client list, there's no videos. I mean, I had Kash Patel. Kash came on the podcast and said there's nothing that you want to see. Bongino, who's always like shouting from the rooftops, we're going to get to the bottom of this and find out who these people are. Everyone's saying no, nothing to see here. And it's like, okay, well, that's why people are cynical. This one's a line in the sand. Yeah. Because this is one where, when we thought Trump was going to come in and a lot of things are going to be resolved. Yeah. We're going to drain the swamp. We're going to figure everything out. And when you have this one hardcore line in the sand that everybody had been talking about forever, and then they're trying to gaslight you on that, they can lie about all kinds of things. And this is today with the internet. Like, look, where's the Epstein files? Boo, can't find them. Mm-hmm. Don't exist. Like, they can get away with shit, man.
Have we finally discovered the limit of MAGA loyalty, do you think?
Well, I think it's interesting because the polling suggests that the sort of rank and file voters in the base haven't turned on Trump, but the influencers have to a certain extent. And that matters, right? These are people who shape public opinion in a significant way. And the sort of Joe Rogans and also Charlie Kirks of the world, what they do affects the rest of the sort of MAGA base. Charlie Kirk, one of the most prominent podcasters in the US right wing. The Epstein handling is something that people are willing to criticize Trump on. What we haven't seen as much breaking with is the obvious closeness of the relationship between Trump and Epstein himself being the main objection, right? So in other words, a lot of the MAGA base is angry that Trump has not followed through on the sort of campaign wink winks and nudge nudges to release the files that they said they would do. But they're not as angry as the liberals would think, the left-wing people would think in America, about Trump actually being a very close confidant of Jeffrey Epstein and hanging out with him all the time and the sort of smoke that's around that issue.
How important do you think it is that all this was essentially kicked off by an angry Elon Musk tweet?
Well, I think it speaks also to the sort of point you were making before about how the deluge of Trump scandal and bizarreness ends up obscuring really important topics, right? Because none of this is new. I mean, the point that you're making with the fact that Musk brought this to the fore through that tweet, it's not like Elon Musk came up with new information necessarily, or that he was making available fresh facts. It's that he brought attention back to something that was already widely known, but had fallen out of the public eye to a large extent, other than from right-wing people who were really upset and convinced that this was a left-wing cover-up, right? That they were trying to cover up the Epstein stuff and the connections to Democrats. When I look at this, my first instinct is that we have to sort of put more pressure on the press to relentlessly chase stories, even if they have fallen out of the sort of main discussion, because they still matter. The Epstein stuff still matters, regardless of whether it's in the fore or not. I think the left wing hasn't grappled with the fact, Democrats in particular haven't grappled with the fact that almost all of the scandals that we have been experiencing over the last 10 years of Trump have barely registered and, in fact, do not bother most of the people who vote for Trump. And this is the one exception where it provides a sort of guideline of how you might be able to attack Trump and splinter the base in a more effective way.
There is actual polling on this. Asked whether a list of Epstein's clients exists, 71% of Americans think it does, and 81% of all Americans think that Donald Trump is personally responsible for hiding information about the Epstein case. So I think that's quite telling, that they're not buying the idea that this is all someone else doing it, or that there's nothing to see here, basically. It's scandalous enough that voters are interested, which is, I guess, the first part of having cut through.
Brian, I wanted to ask you what the House Oversight Committee are doing on all of this. At the time of recording, we've just heard that people like Bill and Hillary Clinton have been subpoenaed to testify on the Epstein scandal. Where are we at with all of that now? Do you see this as a kind of a Republican counter to the pressure on Trump himself, trying to shine the spotlight back on Democrats like Bill and Hillary?
Yeah, so there's 2 points I'd make on this. The first one is that I think there will be people who are on the political left or in the Democratic Party who are implicated in affiliations with and or illegal behavior with Jeffrey Epstein if all of that was made public. I mean, one of the things that I noted very clearly when I saw like the Jeff Bezos wedding, for example, is that it doesn't matter whether you're liberal or conservative in America. If you're invited by a very rich person to go to a posh wedding, you show up, right? I mean, all these celebrities who claim to be, for example, left-wing, will then go and talk to Jeff Bezos at the wedding, and they'll sit next to Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump and so on. And so the sort of club of elites in these spaces is one where if there is a release of this, I expect there will be prominent names from across the political spectrum that will at least be embarrassed by this. And that's part of the reason, which is point 2, more directly to your question, why the Republicans are trying to make this selective evidence against those who they view as political enemies that they think they can get mileage from, attaching them to the Epstein files in public. The best way to think about Republicans in Congress is they are a full-time propaganda outlet for Donald Trump. I mean, every so often they pass laws, but for the most part, what they're doing in hearings is smokescreens for him. And the pretense of actually trying to legislate has been abandoned.
Yeah.
They've ceded control over so much of the process to the president in ways that have long-term implications about presidential authority. And basically what they're trying to do is create content for Fox News or for their own personal brands on social media. And that's what this is about, to my mind.
Well, one area where there might be some seed of Republican pushback, Brian, is something that Kenny and I talked briefly about on Sunday School this week, and I'm delighted we've got you here with us now to get into the detail on it, is the pushback from the GOP side of Capitol Hill around the sacking of the chief labour market statistician, Erica McIntyre, after she published jobs figures that Trump hated. Why has something so prosaic galvanized Republican lawmakers when even more egregious stuff doesn't?
Because they care about getting rich. So, there's a whole bunch of things that Republicans will tolerate.
So they might love Trump, but they love money even more.
Yeah, I mean, but I think that's true. I think that a huge number of donors use Trump as a vehicle to enrich themselves. And for them, they really don't care that much, or they even celebrate some of his more egregious personal behavior, moral stances, authoritarianism, all that stuff is fine with them as long as the gravy train for the elite continues to chug along. And that is predicated in democracies on good economic data and independence of economic data and independence of economic decision making around things like monetary policy.
Any data which comes out now from a new chief Labour statistician will be assumed to have baked in some Trump tweaks to make it more favourable, and therefore could hurt stocks, etc. Is that the point that you think they're most worried about?
So what they're most worried about is that they make decisions based on data, and they now think that there's going to be some cooking of the books. And it's the kind of thing where even if there's not overt pressure, whoever the replacement is going to have an understanding, implicit understanding, that when the jobs numbers are bad, the risk of getting fired goes up, right? That is the kind of stuff that happens in authoritarian regimes where you just twist reality to please the dictator. And this is part of a larger attack on economic independence in the Trump administration's thinking, and Donald Trump himself, with Jerome Powell, for example, who's the chairman of the Federal Reserve, which sets monetary policy and interest rates for the United States. He's been hammering on Powell for a very, very long time. Independent central banks are really important because they're able to make decisions insulated from political pressure, such that they don't just juice the economy before an election and then in the long term it's much worse, right? So they lower interest rates and then, things get better temporarily and then things crash later on. The problem with what Trump's doing is that he's simultaneously saying that the economy is amazing, therefore I have to fire the labor statistician who says it's not, but also saying you have to lower interest rates to the Fed, which is normally what you do when the economy is bad.
He can't have it both ways. He can't say, no, we're booming and the economy doing so brilliantly it's potentially overheating, and simultaneously telling the Fed not to raise interest rates.
I mean, exactly. And I think, the problem is Donald Trump can't really escape this because there's a very simple reason why all these things are trending the wrong direction. It's because of the tariffs. DOGE cuts didn't help with things like jobs numbers. Obviously, the government payrolls have been reduced and so on, but it's mostly just the tariffs and the uncertainty around them. And that's going to filter through. And a lot of that pain economically hasn't registered yet because, for example, a lot of companies before these deadlines, they bought up supplies from overseas suppliers, right? So that they could then avoid the tariff rate. But that's not going to be possible for very much longer. And so all these effects are going to start filtering through the economy. And you can't just increase the costs of goods substantially without having it affect inflation. That's going to filter onto the American consumer. All these things are going to matter. And Trump is going to eventually realize that the reason why almost all economists in the world think his policy is bad is because it actually is.
There's also a wider effect, I guess, in that if you're the person responsible for reporting crime statistics or every area of government that generates basically metrics will now be thinking, will this report displease the boss and will I end up sacked? So everything will be massaged to please the White House. And so you lose touch with objective reality, which I think ultimately is not a great thing for Republicans. They need to know what's actually happening out there if they're going to fashion a campaign, for instance, in the midterms.
There's an extreme version of this that I coined this term called the dictator trap in my work on authoritarianism. And I sort of use the example of Putin deciding to go to war with Ukraine, right? You got 20 years in power, and every time somebody challenges you, they fall out of a window somehow. And so eventually all you get is this sort of funhouse mirror version of reality where none of the hard truths are ever conveyed to you, and you start to make mistakes based on that. And I think that's part of the explanation for why Putin thought that Ukraine would fold in like 3 days and they'd be marching on Kyiv, before the end of the week when they started the war. A much diminished but still important version of that is going to start happening in the United States if you chill objective reality and those who produce it through data. You don't want to be arguing about whether the numbers are real. You want to be arguing about what to do in response to the numbers. And there are critiques of statistics always that are fair. This is not what's happening. This is about simply firing someone because the number was too high in the mind of Donald Trump.
I keep going back to what Kim Darroch told us on this podcast. I don't know if you remember, Naomi, just after the election, where he said that, Trump has this extraordinary media ability to distort the truth. But the one thing that he actually can't change is whether people out there go to the supermarket at the end of the month and can afford their monthly shopping bill on their salary. That is something that people will experience objectively, whatever he does with the data.
Gatorade is the #1 proven electrolyte blend designed to hydrate better than water. So you can lose more sweat and raise your game. Gatorade, is it in you?
More important, I think, is Trump's gradual pivoting on Ukraine and Gaza. Today, Wednesday, as we record, Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff is visiting Moscow in a last-ditch attempt to hammer out a deal ahead of a Friday deadline after which Trump has threatened really draconian economic sanctions. Can this be solved by diplomacy and sanctions still, do you think? Or are we actually on a journey to Trump finally coming to the realization that the only way to do this is to arm Ukraine?
I think the reality of this situation is that Trump likes to be seen as a peacemaker, but he's often not willing to take the steps to actually make that happen. The deadlines are very often not real, right? They change all the time. And, some of Trump's defenders say, oh, it's part of the madman strategy to sort of keep people on their toes and make them guess what he's going to do next. I mean, I think a lot of the policy on Trump's level is made by whim. And then you send these people who are actually trying to negotiate through diplomatic channels like the envoys do. And very often those two aren't joined up. I'm skeptical that Putin will accept any sort of significant ceasefire that doesn't involve concessions from Ukraine that are beyond what European powers will tolerate, let alone what Ukraine will tolerate. So I'm not holding my breath, but I will say it is a positive move relative to the first term when Donald Trump said exclusively positive things about Vladimir Putin.
For me, I think what we're seeing here feels more like Trump trying to land a photo finish foreign policy win in Moscow to look tough while still angling for handshake moments with Putin. And the problem is sanctions from the Trump camp are so often more bark than bite because he changes his mind all the bloody time. And Putin knows that game. So if the plan is send a property developer to make peace with a dictator, I think we're just going to have to lower our expectations, because unless secondary sanctions hit Russian energy in a really meaningful way, which, let's face it, they might do, they might not, this is unlikely to fundamentally shift the war's direction at the moment. And the single biggest thing he can do is just flood Ukraine with arms.
More subtly, I think, but probably more turbulent, is his relationship with Netanyahu beginning to emerge as quite prickly. And you see that in the way I think Trump goes over Netanyahu's head, for instance, to negotiate the release of hostages, or Witkoff was there looking at the aid program the other day. And again, the Israeli administration was slightly cut out of the process. And again, Brian, at the center of this are breakaway MAGA voices like Marjorie Taylor Greene and again Joe Rogan beginning to openly criticize Israel. What do you make of that?
Well, there's a few things. One is that there is a significant souring of U.S. public support for Israel's war in Gaza. Data from Gallup from last week shows that 32% of Americans basically think that Israel's doing the right thing now, which is striking because there has been a longstanding sort of political consensus among the elites in both parties to sort of unequivocally support Israel. And that is particularly skewed by partisan breakdowns. So like something like 70% of Republicans still support Israel's war, whereas the numbers for Democrats are really, really low. With Marjorie Taylor Greene in particular, I mean, I wouldn't make too much of this, right? She's previously said that Jewish space lasers were the cause of wildfires in California. So she's got a long history of anti-Semitic statements, and I don't think she's a fan of the Jewish people in general. And I think a lot of American conservatives have situations in which they use Israel for their own ends. Far-right evangelical Christians sometimes see Israel as a way to sort of usher in the end of days. And so it's not tied to things like, is this just for the Palestinians? It's tied to sort of bigger messianic viewpoints that they have through their own religious belief. But it does, I think it does speak to a turning point. I think what's different about this moment in American politics is that people are saying things criticizing Israel that were very difficult for them to say like a year ago. And I think public opinion is coalescing around the idea that, okay, this war, may have been necessary after October 7th and the horrors of October 7th, but that the suffering is too great. And so there'll be a question for the Trump administration of how long they can continue to sort of unequivocally support Netanyahu in ways that a lot of people view as monstrous in terms of the suffering that's happening around food convoys and impending starvation and so on.
Despite its bolshy stance, the White House will, of course, be worried about these opinion polls beginning to move against Trump. Alex, so what is the latest with them for listeners that don't hawk the poll figures quite as closely as we do?
There was a big A-rated poll that dropped at the start of the week, and it's quite a serious one. It happens only sort of every 2.5, 3 months. And it has him at minus 20 approval, which is 6 points down from April. Now, as you know, I'm cautious around figures in polling, but I'm less cautious when it comes to the movement. You know, I think when you ask a consistent sample and use a consistent methodology, you can trust the direction of travel much more than the exact figures. So there are other polls that show him not as much underwater, although all show him underwater, but they're all moving in this direction. And I think even more worrying to the White House will be the figures of his handling in areas that he is seen as strong, even by independents and even by some Democrats. So you now have 2/3 of Americans disapprove of his handling of the economy, and a stunning slide in his handling of immigration from +1 in April when this tracker was last taken to minus 23 now. From +1 to minus 23. I think that's really quite striking.
For me, I think one of the things that is a truism of both the first term and especially the second term is that if Trump were just an influencer, you know, he would have a stranglehold on his audience. The sort of Trump show is so much fun for those people who love him to watch. The problem is that influencers don't have to govern, and he does. And sometimes when you say things that you then follow through on, it becomes really obvious that it's actually quite harmful. And I think that's what's happening with immigration, right? I mean, if he had stuck to just sort of building a wall on the border with Mexico, he probably wouldn't have seen the slide. But people are seeing, and this is particularly amplified through social media, videos of people just being abducted off the streets from people in sort of masks and balaclavas who are unidentified, aren't showing ID and so on, accidental deportations to gulags in El Salvador. All of these sorts of things filter through. It's a lesson, by the way, to those who are Trump's opponents. When you try to make the case sometimes through intellectual reason and statistics and so on, sometimes you just need one really good instance to show this is what it looks like. And I think that's what Trump has been hurt by on immigration is these individual stories of people who even the most anti-immigrant activists are sort of like, is this really the right thing to be doing?
Yeah.
What I want to know, Brian, is where are the Democrats in all of this? Are they beginning to exploit these opportunities? You know, we've heard about Mamdani, we hear a little bit about AOC, but they feel on this side of the Atlantic to be in this state of paralysis that we've seen since the election. Is there a sense of them beginning to get their house in order and fight back against Trumpism?
The Democrats as a group, no, I wouldn't say. I mean, I think the Democratic brand is pretty shattered, including with people who vote Democratic, right? The sort of party as a whole is viewed by its base as largely hopeless to a great extent and has pretty low trust with its voters. Individual Democrats are, but I think that this is a structural problem with US politics that we don't have anything like the British system with shadow ministers. So there's no sort of point person to talk about this stuff. And then there's infighting when someone tries to emerge to be a, sort of leading voice on it. So, Mamdani surges in the New York primary, and then there's sort of a civil war in the Democratic Party about its future direction over him and so on.
Brian, is there anything constitutionally like preventing the Democrats from saying, we're going to change it up and actually choose a shadow cabinet, like a spokesperson for each policy area, and maybe have our primaries much earlier so that we know who is leading the party by the midterms? Politically, they may be averse to it, but is there anything that prevents them from doing it from a legal or constitutional point of view?
No, they get to make the rules for this type of stuff, and they could even do it unofficially, right? They could just say, our person who's going to be the spokesperson on immigration is this person. I wish they would. The part of the reason why they don't is because of the ethos of decentralization in American politics and the sort of very strong sense of state-based politics as well. So the National Party dictating that sort of stuff would be it would be controversial, but I think it would be much more effective because nobody knows what the Democrats think about a lot of these things because they're getting so many different voices. And many of those individual voices are trying to position themselves for either the midterms or, in the case of some of the higher profile people, for the 2028 presidential election.
Mm-hmm.
But while they're busy abiding by consensus politics, they're fighting a party in the White House controlling all of the major functions of the state, who are busy doing things that help them. They're redrawing the boundaries in Texas, for example. And Trump even said the quiet bit out loud. Let's have a listen.
And you notice they go to Illinois for safety, but that's all gerrymandered. California's gerrymandered. We should have many more seats in Congress in California. It's all gerrymandered. And we have an opportunity in Texas to pick up 5 seats. We have a really good governor, and we have good people in Texas. And I won Texas. I got the highest vote in the history of Texas, as you probably know. And we are entitled to 5 more seats.
And this has resulted in Texas Governor Republican Greg Abbott ordering state troopers to locate and arrest Democratic lawmakers that have left the state to try and prevent the quorum. Brian, is that as terrifying as it sounds, or just one of those uniquely stateside, oh yeah, that happens sometimes kind of things?
Well, there is some precedent for this that Democratic lawmakers have left Texas previously in this sort of same way. I think what's terrifying about this is that it's over the rules of democracy as opposed to things in the past where it's been about, say, abortion policy or something like that, which is a very important issue, but it's not about the system itself. This is the kind of thing where I see the accelerationist decline of democracy at work, because what the Republicans are doing is they attack democracy. They try to undermine it with sort of authoritarian style politics. The Democrats, for quite a long time, have tried to say, no, we're the party of democracy. We play by the rules. And the Democrats have lost as a result of that. So now the base in the Democratic Party is saying, hold on, the response that we should have is to be authoritarian too, in some ways. So let's try to counteract the gerrymandering that they're doing with our own gerrymandering, right? And of course, it's better for everyone if there's no gerrymandering, if it's just a straight up districting process that's legal and fair and so on. But the best way a lot of Democrats argue to get Texas to back down is to open up the process in California and say, all right, you take 5 seats there. We're going to take 10 seats in California. Maybe this will make you think twice. But you can see how this plays out, right? It doesn't play out with democracy getting saved. It plays out with like an accelerationist ratcheting effect that only undercuts democracy further, even if it may be a short-term political strategy that's very viable.
Which I guess leads to the sort of wider question that overhangs all of this. Brian, a ridiculous one to have asked even 2 years ago, but do you expect free and fair midterm elections, or should the US public be preparing for a sort of a new phase of this slide to autocracy? Because looking at the first 6 months, it's pointing to a bad direction.
There's a term political scientists use called competitive authoritarianism, which is where you have all the trappings of democracy, the elections still happen, et cetera, but it's not a level playing field. The debate in political science is the US already there, or is it simply racing there? I think there's a lot of good reason to say the US is already there. When you think that way, the elections are going to happen in 2026. I think there's going to be significant efforts to try to undercut them in ways that are unprecedented. One of the things that really worries me is how the federal government is trying to access voter level data at the states level and is trying to intimidate those who administer elections at the state level in ways that are unclear right now, but are not going to be in favor of democracy. My hope is, and I think this is something that will be the big question for 2026, if Trump is as unpopular as he is now, and if midterm elections follow the path that they usually do, which is where the president's party suffers defeats, even if there is some manipulation or an unlevel playing field, this could actually result in one of the 2 chambers of Congress flipping to the Democrats, and that would be a significant move to constraining Trumpism. I can't understate how important it is that at least one organ of formal government is controlled by the opposition if we're going to stop the slide to authoritarianism.
Quiet riot. Hey, Fidelity. What's it cost to invest with the Fidelity app?
Start with as little as $1 with no account fees or trade commissions on U.S. stocks and ETFs.
That's music to my ears.
I can only talk.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Zero account fees apply to retail brokerage accounts only. Sell order assessment fee not included. A limited number of ETFs are subject to a transaction-based service fee of $100. See full list at fidelity.com/commissions. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE, SIPC.
To wrap up this section, I didn't want to not put corporates on the hook a bit. And I'm talking, of course, about the American Eagle advertising campaign with Sydney Sweeney, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, all-American girl actress. They have put out, for those that don't know, an ad campaign for jeans, which is a play on blue jeans and great genes, so Genes.
She's a registered Republican? Oh, now I love her ad. Is that right? Is Sydney Sweeney? You'd be surprised at how many people are Republicans. That's what I wouldn't have known, but I'm glad you told me that. If Sydney Sweeney is a registered Republican, I think her ad is fantastic. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is a very tidy, memorable hook for marketers to roll out. And to me, Brian, it's like the corporate version of a dog whistle. Throw the match, let others light the fire, bask in the heat of the media coverage. And I guess they were leaning into the growing Gen Z millennial aesthetic trend, often known as tradcore or cottagecore or normcore nostalgia, which idealizes old school family values, blondes and denim, pastoral Americana, and evokes this without overtly political messaging and could appeal to traditionalist consumers without being overtly MAGA. And so it's kind of like walking a tightrope, visually signaling a certain worldview without putting it into words, and then sitting back, watching their stock jump and letting other people, talk about it. Ambiguity, they dodge the accountability and monetize the polarization. We've seen it before in the US with more overtly political brands like Chick-fil-A or MyPillow that do have their own political identity. As far as I know, American Eagle doesn't make partisan donations or have any kind of ideological declarations. But are we now entering a phase where the corporate world is inserting itself into the political pretty overtly, but without coming out and saying it?
Yeah, I mean, the corporate world already does with huge donations in the US, but this is, in terms of a marketing campaign, I think is part of a larger problem with modern economics and politics, which is that courting controversy in ways that are sometimes offensive or, as you say, sort of dog whistles to really objectionable ideas makes a lot of money. The thing that I think has to be the response to this, and this is where I think the US left has failed so far, is the anti-Trump coalition is extremely wealthy relative to the United States. There's a huge amount of money there. And the group that can sort of coalesce around certain movements of consumer behavior is going to be one of the most powerful forces in anti-Trumpism if it can happen. This hasn't happened as much as I wish it would, because the formal organs of government are gone. So what else do you have? And I think the answer is consumer pushback and making corporate America really fear dabbling with ideas that are part of the Trumpist philosophy.
How do you fit into that, the seeming Murdoch-Trump fight that appears to be developing?
The main driver of that is the Wall Street Journal reporting pages, and this is where a lot of the Epstein stories are coming from, and they're doing a very good job, in my opinion, of pushing hard and sticking to their guns on that. The Wall Street Journal reporting pages, they're different from a lot of the sort of opinion journalism that Murdoch produces, both from Fox News and also from the Wall Street Journal op-ed pages. And so that's part of the reason. It's sort of an idiosyncratic part of it. I do think that there are people, though, understanding that actually there is a market for those who break with Trump on the right. And that is different from the first term. I think the Epstein thing was sort of the most visible manifestation of this. But all these people are competing in an attention economy. And if everyone just says Trump is good 100% of the time, they don't differentiate themselves. So what we could see in the sort of second term among the influencers and the podcasters and YouTubers and so on is efforts to sort of take one issue and run with it against Trump. And that could actually matter. That's where the Epstein dynamic provided the first model for this. I don't think Fox News is going to do that. But the one area where we haven't really seen that tested is if the economy truly collapses. Because the first term, the economy was generally okay. And so people with money were willing to either support or at least tolerate Trumpism so long as they kept getting rich. If that starts to usher in a major recession, that would be, to me, the biggest threat for Trump's media control and the Murdoch machine actually turning against him.
Alex, give us a call to action.
Now, if you're worried about the state of democracy in the US and you are listening stateside, you might want to support organizations like Fair Fight Action, which was founded by Stacey Abrams at fairfight.com. US federal law prohibits foreign nationals from donating to election-focused nonprofits, but Brits can donate to organizations like Oxfam America, which fights to empower marginalized communities, advocates for policy change, and provides humanitarian aid during crisis, and we'll drop a link for that in the show notes. There's also C-SPAN. You can help C-SPAN, who has lost all of its federal funding and does a very, very important job of reporting unfiltered from hearings on Capitol Hill, etc. So we'll drop all those links in the show notes for you.
Quiet Riot. It's that time again where outrage is currency, nuance cancelled, and every tweet is one rogue pronoun away from being full societal collapse. Yes, it's that part of the show where we ask, what fresh culture war hell is this? It's time, of course, for Wokey Dokey.
Wokey Dokey.
So, Alex, what little moral panic have you dug up from the bottom of the discourse barrel today?
Okay, so today's topic is a New York Post opinion piece. I thought I'd stay with a theme entitled Smithsonian Exhibit Monkeys Around with the Scientific Evidence on Human Origins. The piece asserts that the National Museum of Natural History seeks to convince visitors of human evolution in order to advance woke ideology.
Or science.
Yeah, I started looking into this and opened a trapdoor into a world of hell that I wish I hadn't, I have to tell you.
Your algorithm is fucked.
I should tell you that the author of the article is one Casey Luskin, who co-founded the Intelligent Design and Evolution Awareness Center and works for the Discovery Institute, which is an organization devoted basically to lobbying for creationism to be taught alongside actual science in schools, or instead of, I suspect. Now, Luskin is a scientist, a geologist of little note, who has zero expertise in anthropology or evolutionary biology. The piece has every hallmark of pseudoscience. It sort of selectively cites a couple of Nature articles improperly summarizing and misrepresenting them, with no links, of course, probably because a few years back, Luskin accused the journal of waging a propaganda war on creationism. To give you a flavor of his criticism, he complains that a reconstruction of the Australopithecus africanus is presented smiling, perhaps at a friend's wry remark. It's not. It is displaying its teeth, as many hominids do for a variety of reasons, mainly aggression. So Luskin then smashes the point home with, yet there's no fossil evidence they were capable of humor.
What?
And I don't know what he expected, like the remains of an Eddie Izzard DVD found with it. I will drop a link in the notes of a very good YouTube video debunking these specific claims.
And I hope producing a laughing fossil at the end of it.
Oh my goodness, I can't tell you what a trapdoor this opened, because in order to discredit science, they have to treat fossils as either ape or human. There can't be things that portray a sort of evolution from one to the other. But there's 2 or 3 species right in the middle of that chain that even the creationist movement cannot decide whether they say are ape or human, and various organizations disagree about it and vehemently fight about it. But the whole thing is just insane. And what is insane is how well-funded these people are and how they present themselves in a sort of V for Vendetta Matrix way, as if everyone has their eyes closed, allowing evil science to suggest that there's nothing special about us as beings, which is obviously nonsense. The process of evolution is a very special process. It means that you develop traits over millions of years. What's more special than that? Anyway, it's a really scary, dark world, and I will drop a link in the show notes on this site throwing light on it. just so you can get an idea of how complicated and Kafkaesque this area is. So this week, evolutionary theory is woke.
Thanks, Alex. Listeners, I don't know that you're going to be able to find something more ridiculously labelled woke than that. But if you think you can top it, send it in to quietriotpod@gmail.com.
Parents of tweens, if you're familiar with far-off drop-offs...
Dad, stop, right here.
Or get DMs about what's for dinner, you may be experiencing tween milestones. For your son or daughter, these can start at age 9. HPV vaccination, a type of cancer prevention against certain HPV-related cancers, can start then too.
For most, HPV clears on its own. But for those who don't clear the virus, it can cause certain cancers later in life.
Embrace this phase. Help protect them in the next.
Ask their doctor today about HPV vaccination. Brought to you by Merck.
Right, now let's turn UK side, guys, to a growing chorus of chaos here in the UK. Because if you're getting a strange sense of deja vu, that familiar summer dread, that uptick in tension, it is not just the heat getting to you. A range of right-wing actors are working very hard to manufacture another long, angry summer, much like last year's riots. And once again, they're being helped along by a media class who seem more interested in platforming provocation than analysing power. Stephen Yaxley Lennon, better known as Tommy Robinson, has managed to get arrested on allegations of violence at a train station, but not before he managed to join an even more right-wing party than Reform UK. That party, fronted by Ben Habib and flanked by a growing constellation of fringe figures, is out to make trouble for Farage, and Robinson is their clickbait in chief. Cue, of course, Elon Musk liking it from the sidelines, like an edgelord dad trying to stay relevant at the alt-right disco. Meanwhile, the UK-France one-in, one-out migration plan is kicking in, being greeted with shrieks of betrayal from both left and right. And the American-based cryptocurrency exchange Coinbase Inc. is now running a very expensively produced ad in style of an old-school musical, claiming that Britain is going to the dogs, and of course decrying an attack on free speech when they were banned from running it across UK TV channels. So we're going to connect some dots from street-level agitation to boardroom backing, from policy paralysis to platform algorithms. We're in a moment where the far right isn't just posturing, they are actively doing it through big tech, billionaires and broadcast influence. And crucially, the lust is being reciprocated. Alex, just how hard are the right trying to manufacture a fresh set of riots this summer, do you think?
I don't think it's even particularly subtle anymore. You can sense it in every press conference, in every tweet, in every statement. They're looking for something. They're looking for a hook. And I would say that so far they're failing. Obviously, I don't want to tempt fate, and events can act as a trigger or a spark in this kind of tinderbox situation. But so far, there are pockets, basically, of demonstrations and protests, but they don't seem to be spreading in any real way. So maybe there are limits to their influencing power. Maybe this is testament to the policy of very visibly and quickly convicting people with very, very harsh sentences in last summer's riots having an effect. Maybe the weather is not nice enough at the moment. Who knows? Maybe the women's team winning the European Championship had an effect by sort of keeping people in pubs celebrating England. I don't know what it is, but so far it seems to be failing, although the more it fails, the more desperate their ploys get. I mean, Farage's last thing on crime, which he now does on a weekly basis, was utterly hysterical.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that Sky made the wise decision to switch away from it after the sort of first minute's introduction, because I suspect that quite a lot that came from that 18-year-old that's in charge of a council now was not actually broadcastable.
I wonder how much the pockets of the right that are trying to fuel the riots are looking at public opinion on it, because YouGov did a poll this week, a year on, how do Britons think the legal system treated those who took part in the riots? And you've got 41% saying fairly, 26% saying unfairly. When you break that down by party, You've got Labour, Lib Dem and Conservative all in the high 40s and 50s saying fairly, but only 16% of Reform UK supporters saying fairly, and 43% of those saying completely unfairly. Are the pockets of the right that are desperately trying to manufacture uprisings looking at that kind of number and trying to react to it, do you think?
If actually only 16% of Reform voters think the rioters last year were treated fairly, then there's a very large segment of Reform voters who are very aware how they will probably be treated if they go out there and start lobbing bottles and cans. So I would point to that actually as evidence that the harshness and swiftness of how riots were dealt with last summer has worked. It has seeped into the public's consciousness, whether you consider it fair or unfair, that you will be treated with harshly.
Brian, when Trump visited the UK last week, he did not hold back in slagging off London Mayor Sadiq Khan to Prime Minister Starmer's face, causing Starmer to awkwardly chime in that Sadiq is actually a friend of his. Why do you think Trump felt the need to do that? What was he trying to achieve?
Bizarrely, in the US right wing, the UK is a dystopian place that like white people can't go. It's really very strange. If you watch sort of reports on Fox News or the more far right Newsmax and OAN and so on, the way they talk about London is like just absolutely at odds with the lived experience of being in London. But it's become this sort of foil for the right of what they see as the sort of left-wing takeover of cities and unlivability that comes with it. So Trump is sort of tapping into that. And I think that's basically the entire gist of it.
Yeah. Well, fresh from the American Eagle Sydney Sweeney ad we talked about in topic 1, I want to talk about that Coinbase advert, Everything is Just Fine, to briefly explain it. Coinbase, who are a cryptocurrency exchange, are essentially making the case for left-wing policies, but they're not, of course. The entire thing is a series of actors living in damp, squalid conditions, losing their job and having to become Deliveroo drivers, getting covered in sewage, having to pay £100 at the till for fish fingers. And it's sort of seeding the whole Britain is broken and something needs to happen. Now, for a cryptocurrency exchange, the thing they presumably want to happen is for a government led by somebody like Nigel Farage who will completely deregulate that market and make them even richer. Of course, if you want to fix any of those issues that they have portrayed in extremis in the video, you would want to say, well, why don't we put a transaction tax on crypto transactions? But I'm fairly confident that is not what they're calling for. They've said that it's terrible that this can't be broadcast on British television. Well, one of the reasons it can't is because no political advertising outside of party political broadcast is allowed on British TV, which is one of the only things stopping the UK democracy from being in quite such the parlor state as in America. But I'd love to ask you both, are we now in an era where, because actually Brits are watching more YouTube than any other form of broadcast bar the BBC, that we're going to have to change our advertising laws to cover them too, because that's presumably the loophole around the political advertising restriction?
I mean, yes, is the simple answer to that. I mean, YouTube is now a major broadcaster and should be regulated in terms of its advertising standards like everyone else. Because the problem is that licensed news channels are now picking up the ad and using it as a factual basis for a conversation. Here's GB News.
It's grand. Your life can get no better when you live it by the letter in this pleasant land.
Yeah, that's an advert basically explaining how everything is broken and why we should buy this particular product because everything seems broken in Britain. Catherine, just how broken is the economy?
To me, the thing that's so strange about that ad, first off, I think despite its problems, I chose to move to Britain. I think the declinist narrative really is wrong. I think there's lots of things that need to be fixed about the country, but it's still like not the way it's described in the ad. But the other thing that's so bizarre about it is there's a section in the ad where like these people in the convertibles say like, we're off to Dubai. And I guess they're trying to say that like rich people are fleeing because they can't handle this anymore. But it's like, if you're reading this from my perspective, it's like these two things are linked. Like all the stuff you're showing about the declinist aspects, it's because like people who are selfishly trying to enrich themselves are screwing over everyone else by like not paying tax, right? So if they just had a different ending to that ad, it wouldn't be as objectionable to me. The sort of Coinbase thing at the end is the weirdest bit.
And of course, the least believable bit of the whole ad is that there is still somebody working on the till at checkout and that it's not an automated machine.
Well, you don't think fish fingers for 100 quid is the least believable?
I think that's more believable than having somebody on a till.
The reason they're entering that space is the same reason that far-right parties enter that space. I had a really interesting conversation with Peter Gagan a couple of weeks ago, where he was saying that part of, for instance, Reform UK now accepting donations in cryptocurrency is an understanding that there is a lot of influence and there's a lot of dark money there waiting to be donated. And so it's not so much about the method, because actually someone rich can find a way to donate it much more simply by creating a shell company in the UK, say a gym. What they're doing is they're signaling to these people that we are open to you, we are listening. But going back to what you were saying about London being portrayed as this dystopia by people like Trump and Nigel Farage, telling a journalist, I dare you to walk through the West End of London after 9 p.m.
Is this Project Fear? Are you trying to make people afraid and trying to steer them into fear, and therefore that is the way you will get them to vote for you?
No, they are afraid. They are afraid. I dare you to walk through the West End of London after 9 o'clock of an evening wearing jewellery. You wouldn't do it. You know that I'm right. You wouldn't do it.
What are you talking about, man? It's a sort of imported method of campaigning from the States, where it works because you can portray LA and New York as these hellholes. And the vast majority of people in the middle of America, because it's such a vast place, will never really experience those cities. They will take what you say as given. But in a small country like the UK, there was a massive backlash against that idea. And a lot of it came from people who don't live in London, but come to London to go to the theatre once in a while or for Christmas shopping, that don't recognize that picture. And so when you have a voting public that know what you're talking about is a lie, I'm not sure that strategy is importable.
I think there is just enough in the ad for most people to recognize a portion of it. There are lots of people struggling, even if it is sensationalized. So the bit where the guy gets made redundant and, inability therefore to pay off their law school fees, etc., or, the issue of the damp housing and mold and terrible landlords, there is just enough in it that it is clever. I mean, I'm not going to deny that it is an incredibly well-produced ad, but it is sensationalized and it is incredibly dangerous. And as Brian says, the incongruity between what they're saying is the problem and what we fucking well know would be the solution that they would not swallow.
But as a political ad, it would be clever. But will it make people invest in crypto?
Well, it was a political ad.
So then we get into this tricky area that makes me think, was this just a way actually for a crypto company to donate money to particular YouTube channels that will be carrying this ad more than anything else, actually?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Tommy Robinson then has joined an even more extreme party. He's got arrested again. Elon Musk has given it all lots of likes. We've joked before about the algorithm being radicalization on rails. But are we now seeing an example of the far-right ecosystem kind of fully closing the loop from political fringe to tech billionaire endorsement in under 48 hours?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, the sort of the acceptability of being seen to be in bed with far-right politics has really changed since 2016 through 2020, right? I mean, there was, especially in the United States, there was a really big corporate backlash to right-wing politics after both January 6th and also because of the Black Lives Matter movement. And now it's sort of just like open season. You can sort of just cozy up to whatever odious political player you want to. And that's why that point I was making before is like, unless those on the political left actually start voting with their wallets and holding companies accountable and so on, the billionaires are just going to keep doing this. It's self-interest, right? I mean, I think this is the kind of stuff where they're getting deregulation, they're getting tax breaks. They're in favor of all the sort of economic policies of the far right. There has to be a cost imposed on them. And that's, I think, where it's up to organizing economic actors. That's one of the new jobs of left-wing politicians, in my opinion, in the 21st century.
Agreed. Right, final issue. The UK-France one-in, one-out deal is being rolled out this week, initially as a trial with cap numbers, and is the closest thing to a safe legal route for refugees that has yet been offered by a British government. What do we think its chances of success at smashing the gangs is actually going to be, Alex?
That depends on how it's used. I suspect border control have now a relatively good idea of the players in this area, right? The big gangs that are pushing this sort of undocumented person across the channel. If they pick them off one by one, it could be very successful. If there's an element of randomness, we'll grab one person that looks vaguely incongruous to us and send them back every week. Then it becomes a numbers game for people wanting to cross. They will think it's still a pretty high chance that I will be allowed to stay. If it becomes a targeted affair, so let's say that border control dedicate their 50 people a week or however many there will be to one particular ring, so that the vast majority of people paying that person to cross the channel end up being sent back, then I could see it working really well, because that kind of community talk to each other. And if word spreads that if you pay that person, they're really being targeted at the moment, then bosh, you knock one of them out of the equation, you destroy their business. And so if that tactical approach is taken, and obviously this is a pilot scheme, the numbers might increase, I can see it being quite successful as a deterrent. I'm not making a moral judgment on it as a policy. I think it adds to the really destructive noise about immigration somehow being represented by the tiny amount of people that cross the channel in that way, and that tiny amount of people somehow being responsible for every problem in the country. I think it adds to that, and I think it's unfair and ultimately damaging. I'm just saying that if your aim is A, to stop this kind of crossing, this seems to me like it could be operationalized in a way that goes a long way to reducing the numbers.
Okay, we're going to move on to call to action. It is a slightly left field one, after all that right-wing shithousery. We talked about YouTube now being the second biggest source of media in Britain, with only the Beeb delivering content to more people. And even older people are starting to use it more. A lot of people watch YouTube on their tellies, of course. And a lot of what is on YouTube is news. And young people in particular are getting a huge amount of it from their YouTube feed and indeed other platforms. But why is this significant to you, the Quiet Riot listener? Well, like the rest of us, you probably have your go-to sources for news, a favourite publication, a few trusted websites, the BBC, and quite possibly Blue Sky, where we all hang out. And the thing is, if you want to know what other people are thinking, if you want to understand more about what might be driving and influencing them, it is a good idea to check out the media that other people consume. So if you're not using YouTube for news, go into incognito mode in your browser, very importantly.
Very important.
Very importantly.
Because otherwise you'll be served up this stuff for weeks.
Forever. And Google YouTube News and have a look at it. It's algorithm driven, so the feed will be influenced by what you search for on there, what YouTube knows about you once you started getting into it in incognito mode. And it won't tell you much about exactly what other people are watching, but at least you'll start to get a feeling for how the ecosystem so many people are now using for news actually works. You don't have to enjoy it, by the way, but if you're politically engaged enough to listen to this show, then it is smart to have a passing acquaintance of how increasing numbers of people in this country are getting their information sifted, sorted, and algorithmically controlled.
Right then, Naomi, I am in need of something wholesome, hopeful, or at least slightly Schadenfreude adjacent. What have you got for us this week in Grin and Share It?
Good news is welcome to me. Bad news is hell come to me. Good news. I want good news.
Well, Alex, sometimes good news comes in the form of puppies. Sometimes it's a grassroots climate win. And sometimes it's a former authoritarian president being placed under house arrest by the Supreme Court of Brazil. Yes, you heard it right. Jair Bolsonaro, the not-so-retired strongman and coup-curious ex-president, is now officially confined to his home while facing criminal charges related to his attempt to overturn Brazil's 2022 election. The Supreme Court ruled that Bolsonaro orchestrated efforts to delegitimize the electoral process, including, plot twist, drafting a decree to annul the election and keep himself in power. He is accused of knowingly peddling election lies and conspiring to undermine Brazil's democracy. I think that all sounds pretty familiar, probably most of all to Brian. But here's the good bit. Brazil's institutions held, and despite threats, mob violence, and copycat tactics lifted straight from the Trump playbook, the Brazilian judiciary stood its ground. And now, Bolsonaro's passport is gone, his movement is fractured, and the world has one fewer would-be autocrat free to fly around the world, stirring up mischief. So this week, not a story about puppies, but it is a story about accountability. And that, dear listener, is definitely something to grin and share.
Thanks, Naomi. Listeners, as ever, we'll drop a link in the show notes so you can not just grin, but also share it.
And just like that, another episode of Quiet Riot slips serenely over the horizon. Thank you so much for joining us on today's journey through the choppy political sea, and we look forward to your company again for Sunday School in just 3 days' time.
All that remains is to thank our guest, the lovely, lovely Brian Klaas. We have missed you. We hope you slowed down things sufficiently in your life to make these appearances a more regular feature, Brian.
Thanks so much. Delighted to come back.
Please consider supporting us at ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod. And if you can't stretch to a few quid there, why not recommend us to a friend or an enemy? We are a broad church after all.
And if you're in the mood for more political pastime, check out our bookshop. There's a link in the show notes, and every purchase supports the podcast, independent booksellers, and, of course, the authors. How's that for a happy ending? Oh, and it does include several of Brian's books.
Until then, stay alert, stay engaged, and keep that quiet, rioty attitude to everything that is going on in our strange but very beautiful world.
Thanks again for listening. You're all wonderful.
Bye.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith and Alex Andreou. Produced by Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta. Artwork by Simona Canelu. And edited by me, Alex Reese. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Sandstone Global.
Quiet Riot. He just knows how to throw that insult, but it's a common insult when it comes to people of color. He just threw the same exact insults as Charlemagne the God. This is a person that has a problem with people of color, period. I don't care how many black MAGA out there with their hats. I want to be clear, when we look at who it is that he's kicking out of this country as people of color, when we look at who he always disrespects and says that they are low IQ, even though when you look at his cabinet, when we're talking about people that have the ability to drop bombs and they literally don't know how to get the signal chat right. I've got news for the president. I am not going anywhere. No matter how many squiggly lines they draw in the state of Texas, I will be back.